This is Mommying While Muslim, recorded live and unedited. Watch as Zeba and Uzma record their podcast, see their reactions, and find out for yourself what all the buzz is about.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. This is Zeba Hassan with another episode of Mommying While Muslim. My lovely co-host is actually with her children right now, which is what happens in the summer, of course. She'll be back next week, and she'll be talking a little bit about what she's experiencing right now with her teens and starting to think about the post-high school life. I know she's a little bit stressed out, so I'll let her talk about that. But, July is here. It's like midsummer. I love it. And we really, I feel like, brought the heat with our segments on moms and gun control. And, it was one of those things where I kind of had to delve into and learn a little bit about that topic myself, just because it wasn't something that I was too familiar with. So it was definitely a learning experience for me. But you know what? It was a stark reminder about like how in the blink of an eye, in a sound bite, that your lives can be forever altered in a moment of violence. It only seemed fitting that we would follow up that series with our Muslim moms, Death and Dying. We are so honored to have with us a friend of the podcast and, of course, our heart, Kristen Jawad. Kristen is a Muslim chaplain and a life coach who has counseled people through grief for over 20 years. And we're going to talk a little bit about what chaplaincy means, because I know I'm really interested in this. Like, what are some of her insights and her experiences with these different types of life transitions that we are getting to a certain age where we're experiencing them. But Kristen, I just wanted to first of all say thank you so much for being our opening podcast episode on this very, very important topic.
Thank you so much, Zeba. I'm happy to be back, and I missed you.
Oh, I know. She's like literally one of my favorite people. I love everything that she has to say in her life and her worldview. So I feel blessed and honored that she's here today. But, we always kick off the podcast talking a little bit about what our family background is. So do you mind telling us a little bit about your family background, your mommying philosophy, whatever you care to share?
Yes. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I've lived for over 20 years now in close to the Seattle area. I've raised 2 young adult men and got 2 cats and 2 chickens. And it's funny because our parenting philosophy often transfers over to how we raise our pets. It's kind of a joke between me and my husband. Yeah.
I 100% agree with it. Like my fur, it went from having pictures of my kids on my phone to now I have tons of pictures of my cats and my pets. So like I hear you. It becomes that next, you become like a cat lady, a dog lady, a pet lady, once your kids don't need you as much as they used to physically need you. But we're going to start off right now because the first question I had, because of course I have kind of like a connotation of what the word chaplain actually means. So explain to our audience, what is chaplaincy? How can you be a chaplain and Muslim? And explain a little bit of the nuances as to what that means for the community in general and for the Muslim community specifically.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So in the general sense, a chaplain was someone who was ordained through a specific faith community and usually has a master's in divinity and a background as a preacher and someone who had a role in a church setting. And then some of the first chaplains actually served in the military, and they were deployed with troops. As far back as like probably World War I and even before that, but at least in the US context, they've had positions in the military as well as hospital settings. And now it's starting to become more common on university campuses, actually, for students to have access to chaplains. And so there's a difference between a chaplain and a preacher, and they have different roles. So it's interesting because there's a lot of confusion or kind of like mystery for the Muslim community because we don't really have that term chaplain. People are familiar with the term imam. or maybe even like Quran teacher. But we didn't really have someone who fulfilled that role in that lens. But I do want to say that we have that tradition of spiritual caregiving, which is really the focus of chaplaincy. And obviously, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is like our number one example of spiritual care providing, and even like mannerisms of like turning our bodies and really absorbing what people are saying, respectfully listening without judgment, with a lot of care. So in a nutshell, I think the Muslim community is kind of warming up to the term chaplain and realizing that we do have that connection and that lineage. And we're finding ways to gain that experience and pathways through the structures that already exist, the institutions that already exist. There's been some kind of patchwork to make that happen for people that wanted to become chaplains and to be recognized, and especially women, because they didn't necessarily hold that role. There isn't, it's a little controversial, like women imams, but a chaplain is something that has a different focus.
That's perfect, because this segues into my next question. Like, as far as like, life, we're talking this month about life transitions and of course death and dying specifically, but like a life transition, you have the imam that performs the wedding ceremony and these types of things. But so how is that different, having like an imam present at a life transitional event, whatever that happens to be, versus like a Muslim chaplain at that same event, and specifically for the topic at hand, at that end of life passing?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So an imam could potentially be a chaplain. They could have training in spiritual support. It usually involves family counseling and some end of life ethical decisions. But a chaplain has specific training for that. And I didn't mention before that there are chaplains of all faith backgrounds, as well as non-denominational, as well as even atheist chaplains. So there's a difference between spiritual care and then like religious teachings. And so although a chaplain could perform a wedding in the Muslim community, it's usually the imam. But for example, if a couple's at a hospital, in a hospital setting, they might want that. So at the end of life care, it could be that, a couple is pregnant and they've lost. I know you did a whole series on, fertility and infant loss. So it could be that there's someone there to perform a special prayer and the washing for a couple that's lost a baby in a hospital. It could be an elderly person that's dying. It could be a cancer diagnosis that family needs support around, medical decision making. So there's a lot of ways that a chaplain could support. Also, it's not just the patient. It could be the spouse of the patient. It could be the extended family. Could be the friends. It could be anyone really that's in the constellation of caring for the patient. Yeah.
I'm putting myself on mute because of course my housekeeper comes, and Joe's going to take this out in post-production, and they usually come at 8 a.m. and they decided to come late today. And I'm like, you're going to hear. So that's why I have to go mute in between so that you don't hear my sound bite. But, I love that. So it sounds like, just to confirm what you're saying, is that a chaplain somebody who has that extra spiritual support, like they can provide that extra spiritual support that these types of life transitions might happen to need, versus just coming from it from a religious fiqh perspective, and you need to have a little bit of extra training in order to perform those duties. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and it's not that imams can't gain those skill sets, and in fact they've been pretty much put in the hot seat oftentimes to deal with all kinds of things like divorce, domestic violence. Like our imams in the U.S. serve so many roles. It's like they're a one-stop shop, and And I think for a lot of imams, they have decided to also become chaplains.
I was going to say, my hope is that they would try to get this extra skill set. And I know that is something that Uzma and I on the podcast really are trying to push, is that universal, having that extra training, because like you said, they are that one-stop shop, and we as a community need to have more people like yourselves doing the work so that we can get the support that we need. So, we're talking primarily about death and dying this month because we call ourselves the sandwich generation. We still have young kids or younger kids, but our parents are getting elderly. We're having to make these types of decisions, and it is a hard thing to navigate, right? Because we're in the throes of parenthood, but we're still having to make these really tough end of life decisions. So, I'd like to ask you a personal question. Like, what was one of the reasons why you decided to go into something that is or can be so emotionally draining for the practitioner?
Yeah. So about 3.5 years ago, one of my dear friends was dealing with a cancer diagnosis, and we really didn't know how much time she had. And she started the chemotherapy route, and quickly, her quality of life diminished. And that was the first time that I had the experience of going through hospice and seeing how her 4 children responded to, losing their mom. And I realized she needed support, her children needed support, our girlfriend group, needed support, the extended community. And actually it was during COVID. And so a lot of people were cut off from grief counselors, and as well as some of the rituals and the gatherings, that the Muslim community does for the funerals and the Quran reading. And a lot of work has to happen. The paperwork happens after someone passes, but then the aftercare, right? Like, you don't just flip a switch and once you've buried the person, the grieving process isn't over. It can go on for years, actually. So where do we turn, and what do we do? And how do we deal with questions like, why did this happen? Or, people turn to their own mortality. Like, for a lot of people, the first time they're really up close and personal with a death, they realize life is so precious. We can lose someone at any time. And I think, especially for families that lose, loved ones, young people, to like car accidents or gun violence, it kind of flips the narrative of what we are expecting. We expect it's going to be our elderly that are passing, right? And so that's one kind of grief. But when it's, an infant or a teenager or a really young person, we can be caught off guard, and it can make us question, like, what is our purpose, and what is our life plan, and like, where is God in all of this, and what do I believe? Because you can get people, well-meaning people, trying to support you in the process, but sometimes it's not helpful, the comments that we get.
That's 100% true. And a lot of the times, like, I just, and it's funny, because not funny, it's a coincidence that I had a very close family friend. He recently passed last month, actually, from pancreatic cancer after dealing with that. And today happens to be his birthday. And it was just one of those things where I woke up and you feel it, right? Because you're always so used to like talking. And of course, your instinct is, let me wish him a happy birthday. And of course, then I just reached out to his sister, who happens to be one of my best friends. And she told me, like, you go through the grieving process, and then think moments like this hit you along the way. Like, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. But if you're not used to this, like, this is an unexpected death, even though we kind of knew it was coming for a while, but what are those stages that somebody might be looking to or experiencing when they're dealing with a death of a loved one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for some people, they experience like shock, right? Like, they kind of go numb. They don't feel anything, and they are so taken off guard that they're just uncertain about, like, is this even true? Like, how could this be? Like, they're in denial. They can go into denial. Um, And for some people, if they're expecting their loved one to pass, there's some sense of relief. And then there's maybe some guilt of like, why do I feel relief that my loved one's not suffering, but I miss them so deeply? It isn't really a linear process, but there are some stages. And like you mentioned, anniversaries, like it can snap you back in a moment. For some people, it's like smelling a certain food that their mom cooked, or, holidays, realizing you can simultaneously experience joy and grief at the same time. So sometimes these events are like bittersweet. And I know Eid is coming up soon. And so oftentimes people remember, and they tell stories. So there's a lot of ways we can support each other.
100%. And that's the funny thing you mentioned just now, like some comments you receive, because I think it is such an awkward thing sometimes, and you don't know what to say, how to best support someone. But, because our community can be a little bit awkward, can you tell us a couple of things that we shouldn't say, or it's probably not best to say when somebody is grieving?
Yeah, I think one of the pitfalls is like comparison, like, well, at least, like minimizing someone's grief, or just trying to avoid it in general, like to ignore their emotions, to ignore their sadness, and to try to cheer them up. They're in a better place. God needed another angel, these things that we hear that are not helpful. And I think it's difficult in the way we live today, but to just practice silence, like awkward silence is okay. Like not leaving people alone, even if you're afraid you're going to say the wrong thing. I think it's a really beautiful thing to companion someone, to sit with someone so they're not alone. And your presence, all you have to do is be present, with a kind heart. And it's okay to even say, to verbalize, I don't have any words. I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. And I don't want you to be alone. Yeah.
I love that. And I love what you just said about it's okay to lean into the silence. I think that is just something I would love anybody in any circumstance. It's okay to lean into silence. Like that's a viable option. And sometimes the awkwardness, you feel like I have to fill in the gaps, or, your brain is working overload, like, and I have to say something. You don't have to, because your presence, your physical being is energy, and people can feel that. And so just, I love that you said that, because that's one of the things that I also tell, like, you could just be present and just be available and just offer your, like offer just to like bring food to you, or do things to like take your kids out. I help in little ways if you don't know what to say, because there's no right or there are some wrong answers, but there's no right answer in dealing with this. But there's a lot of trends nowadays, and how I just read something recently, like there's a lot of rituals around, like for instance, in the Jewish faith, about when somebody passes and it's part of their mourning period. Can you speak on any kind of rituals that you've seen within the Muslim community that kind of help aid in this process?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning some of the Jewish rituals. I think that we can learn a lot, and we can expand our ideas about what grief rituals can look like. So for sure, there are families that, they have a janazah, they go to the cemetery, they participate in the funeral. And then often there's a Quran reading, maybe a week out, a month out, 40 days, and then maybe an annual cycle. But we can create our own personal grief rituals, whatever is comforting to you. And I would invite people to explore. Maybe it's being in nature. Maybe it's writing poetry. There's been some amazing grief poetry that has been shared in our online grief groups. So I would also recommend to people that they seek out grief support groups. That, I think, can be a way. And I've been offering for over a year now online Zoom grief support specifically for Muslims. So the storytelling, like just telling the stories, using the name of your loved one, and for some people, they feel like my friends and family are sick and tired of me talking about this, but I'm not done telling this story, or I need to express myself. So finding safe space where you can express and no one will shut you down and no one will take away from, the feelings that you want to express. I think those are all great rituals or ways of grieving. Some people express through art. There's art therapy, working with a counselor or a grief coach. Yeah, those are just a couple things off the top of my head.
So you mentioned specifically group counseling or group support, grief support, and I know that's something you do a lot of. What is the benefit for somebody? Because, in our community, a lot of us are like, I don't want to talk about these things to one person, let alone in a group of people. But there are huge benefits in recognizing that you're not alone in a situation. So how do you convince our community members that group grief support is a thing, and two is a viable option and really helps aid in that grieving process?
So shared reality, just realizing that we all connected to humanity experience grief. All of us are going to experience death and loss. And grief isn't just around, losing loved ones to death. I mean, there's all forms of grief. So I want to say that. And even when you lose someone, for example, our women that shared losing their spouse, a lot of them had similar experiences where they had children and now they were single parents and they were grieving, the loss of their partner and the support. And it was really healing to be with other women that were going through this similar experience. Not the same. Every person's grief is different, has a different nuance, but shared reality of similar experience, I think, is supportive. And also learning from someone who may be a little bit further along in their grief journey, things that other people found helpful, just listening to hear, is that something that I want to try? Or kind of like a heads up, like I can potentially anticipate something similar. I think that was helpful. Also, for sharing stories about losing parents, especially if you've lost both your parents, there's this sense of being an orphan in the world, and then wanting to seek out a relationship with an elder. Not that it replaces the relationship you had with your parent, but we are meant to live in intergenerational settings and in community. So I think grief group work has a special way of creating a shared reality and a support group that you can't get really in one-on-one counseling. I think that's supportive to be in a group for sure.
That's 100%. I'm a big believer, because there's something to feeling, like you said, there's some people that are further along, or some you can see similarities, or you might feel like, I don't feel like sharing right now, but I can just be there to help somebody else go through something, and that becomes part of your own journey, right? In healing. So I absolutely love that. But you've had so many years, decades, even though you look like a baby yourself, but decades of experience in helping people. What are some of the can you tell us a story of something that really stands out to you, specifically with like an end of the life story? Obviously, you mentioned your friend that had got a cancer diagnosis, and of course, that was something very personal to you. But do you have another story that you can share with us that really stands out to you? One, and how they handled the grieving process, what you did for them, and where they are now in their journey, if you're aware of that.
So I have an example story to share. There was an elderly woman who she spent many years basically immobile. She was receiving home nursing care. And I attended her end of life celebration, actually, where her friends and family were there, her granddaughters were there, her caregivers for many years were there, and she was able to share some blessings before she passed, which was really touching. And I think, the most beautiful thing was seeing the people that all knew her come together, and they were there to support her daughter and her granddaughters. And so, not that that took away from the pain and the grief, but I think holding both, right? Like celebrating who she was, her sense of humor, the storytelling, that was beautiful. And leaving people alone during their grief, I think, it is, it's really sad in our society these days, because people kind of like, they attend the funeral and then they just kind of move on. But touching back and having different points where you can support in different ways, even sending notes on anniversaries, right? So I think that was a beautiful experience, watching how her daughter was supported after her mother passed. And yeah, I mean, that's one that I remember.
I actually just read a story of somebody who got a cancer diagnosis, knew she was passing, and was just kind of like, came to peace with it. And she held, and I thought this was a fascinating way of, one, celebrating her life, and two, allowing people to mourn with her while she was still alive, and essentially had a memorial service for herself while she was alive, and everything that and at first I thought that was a little, I'll be honest, look, when I saw the title, I was a little like, oh my gosh, that's a little creepy. But when I read it, I was like, wow, that is something. There's something to be said of that. Like, that people see her at peace, and when they see her at peace, you can then celebrate her life. What, as a professional, what do you feel about this? Of course, I have my own opinion about it, but what do you feel about this? And do you feel that this could potentially be like a trend in the grieving community, and how we can kind of start taking more proactive steps in starting that healing process when you get when you get bad news?
I think in the Islamic perspective, um, we keep this idea that we're going to die, we are going to return to Allah. We keep that in our, in the forefront of our mind, not in a morbid way, but just this reality of, we're here for a short time. And there is the saying, die before you die. And it's interesting that you mentioned this kind of process where you can invite people to come. I attended a death meditation for someone's birthday. Actually, we did that as a group, and I know a lot of people were not interested, but I thought, I'm curious and I'll try anything once. So I went, and it was a really peaceful experience. There was someone who led the meditation, who described being in the grave. And I think each one of us had a different experience, but embracing this idea that we are going to die. And in fact, we experience a lot of loss and death along the way, not just of people, but like who we were, what our dreams of ourself, for our future was going to be. And I think it's a helpful practice. It might not be appealing to everyone, but I think, especially if you have a loved one who has a diagnosis, who has limited time, being able to say goodbye while they're still alive, to be able to say the things that are really on your heart, to tell the truth. I mean, what a relief! What a blessing! And I think that's one thing that I want to invite people to consider, to not leave your loved ones with questions about what you want for your funeral, for your will, for especially related to medical decisions, right? Like if someone passes or they are going to be experiencing artificial feeding, like I don't want to get into all the details about the medical decisions, but if you can, and I know Uzma probably has tons of resources that she can share, but prepare so that your loved ones are not left with really difficult decisions. I think the more we talk about death, the more we embrace that that is our reality and that we are returning to Allah. I think the more comfortable we can make the awkwardness.
I 100% agree. And I just wanted to go back a little bit and touch on something you said. Like grieving is not just about the end of life. Like you can grieve your old version of yourself, or maybe past relationships, or maybe you had a best friend that ghosted you and you're like, where did that happen? So from a grieving emotional standpoint, are there differences in how we feel that grief depending on the permanency, I guess, of the situation, or is it similar? Would you approach, I guess, would you approach the situation similarly or different? Like how would you approach the situation depending on what happened? Like let's just say, I have a friend, we're no longer friends. Of course you still miss that person, but maybe, you've outgrown each other. You're grieving the loss of that. Do you handle that the same way? Or is there something different? Because I know there are people that go into deep depression at the loss even of friendships or relationships, or you're getting divorced. How do you as a chaplain navigate those situations?
Yeah. Well, I think that each person experiences grief differently. And like you said, there's different life cycles. And so just respecting the fact that I don't know. I don't know what each person's feeling, but I can listen. I can show up with an open heart. And they take the lead. And so as a chaplain, I can share resources with them if that's helpful. I can help them identify what's comforting to them. I can help them process their emotions and create a safe space. I mean, I know it feels awkward for some people to share really what's on their heart, that they might be crying about, relationships that they've lost. Or they might be caught off guard. Like everyone knows death, can be touch you deeply, or a divorce. But why, such an emotional upheaval on a friendship, or, even the loss of a job. I mean, any type of loss, really, it can touch us deeply. And I think that it can reactivate different grief. So when we've lost a loved one, it may bring up previous deaths, previous losses, and we can be caught off guard. Yeah. So each person has a different experience. And I think listening to them share what comforts them and to remind them to practice self-care. I think those are key things.
That's great. Self-care is huge, right? As far for I always feel like that's the answer to anything, because if you can't take care of yourself, it's really hard to take care of other people. What are some things that you would recommend for somebody to remind them? Let's say I'm a friend, I have somebody else going through this. What is something that I can do to help facilitate self-care and be a good friend at the same time?
Well, I ask people what actually brings you comfort. What do you usually do? So to touch back, instead of trying to create new habits, go back to habits that have always served you, because usually when people are experiencing grief, they have less energy. They may have less appetite, or they might be eating more to comfort themselves. They might find that their sleep is disturbed, or they might be, getting more sleep because they don't really want to face the day. So no, just normalizing and saying those are all things that people experience, the full spectrum, not feeling any shame around it. And to maybe set a reminder to ask them, would it be helpful if I invite you for walks? And you can say no, and even if you don't live in the same city as someone, I think COVID helped everyone become more creative about how to reach out and support. It might be, would you like to read Quran together? Would you like to light a candle and say special prayers together? We can be creative. We can get our art journals out. Even if we're not together, we can do that together online so that I'm helping hold you gently accountable. It could be mailing special care packages to someone, teas, books of inspiration, really anything that you think would be supportive, and to reach out, keep reaching out.
That's because sometimes you feel like, am I bothering that person? Like, am I, in reaching out, am I reminding the person of, and it is this weird thing because one, like in this particular circumstance, with my childhood friend, obviously I'm mourning myself, not to the same degree, of course. So you're dealing with your own emotions and you're like, how much do I want to reach out to remind her and this and that? But then I found, like, to your point, in talking about the person and sharing stories and memories, it can be really, really helpful. So your advice would be keep reaching out and letting that person kind of meet you where they are and just being open to receiving them in whatever capacity they can come and they can present themselves to you.
Definitely. And to take a note from our younger generation, just sending an emoji, like a hug emoji. Like it doesn't have to be, it could be a short text. I'm thinking about you. And even if they don't respond, that's okay. Like sometimes they don't have the energy to respond.
I absolutely agree. So, obviously we thank you. We love you here on Momming While Muslim and everything that you do. Where can people find you if they are going through something? You mentioned some offering some online group and grief group counseling and services. Like, so where can people find you? What are some things that you're offering right now if somebody is going through something that they need a little bit of extra support?
Mm-hmm. So people can find me at callthechaplain.com, and I know the links are going to be in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say that I do offer in-person and virtual grief walks. So that's ongoing. And then if people feel like they want one-on-one support, I can certainly, have sessions like that. Also, in October, we are organizing a traumatic grief group support. So I know you've done a lot of episodes on taboo topics. So people that have lost loved ones due to gun violence, suicide, any other kind of tragedy. We're forming a support group now, and that will start in October. So I can share links for that as well. And then, I think I'll be offering some ongoing support groups through the years. But I think summer is a time where people are quite busy. So I think in the fall, we'll start that up.
No, I absolutely love that. And like you said, people can reach out to you one-on-one if they need a little bit of that extra support. So we definitely appreciate you. I'm glad I called the chaplain today. And thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, this episode kickstarted our Death and Dying Life Transitions podcast series. We're not going to, just if people are listening, and they're a little bit nervous about trigger word, we're not going to be talking about anything in particular, but just about how to help yourself go through that process, where we can find those answers and helping somebody else go through the process. And obviously highlighting women that are already in our community doing that work. So thank you so much, Chaplain Jawad. I really appreciate you, Kristen. And this was another episode of Momming While Muslim.